All right, I think we're ready to go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our HRC speaker event. My name is Christina Stanchu, and I'm an associate professor of English at VCU and the director of the Humanities Research Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. And I encourage you to check our entire series of virtual events this semester, free and open to the public, which are organized around the theme race, ethnicity, and social justice, as well as our Meet the VCU Authors series. For their help in setting up these events, I would like to thank Katie Reagan-Palmore, the HRC Administrative Coordinator, as well as the communications team in the Dean's Office. They include Tyler Conrad, Jen Elswick, and Alexis Fink. Also, many thanks to the Dean's Office for their continued support of the humanities. As I keep mentioning in my introductory remarks, in these intense virtual times, still pandemic times, the humanities more than ever have the power to generate empathy and to enrich our lives, to strengthen our communities, and to help us build a more just society. I'd also like to thank the alumni in the audience. I see some of you and the graduate students and the undergraduate students who are attending, and to all of you really for continuing to support the HRC at VCU. If you'd like to receive our brand new monthly newsletter, please click on the link that Katie Reagan is posting now in the chat. Or reach out to us by email. And at some point, Katie Reagan will post a link to our speakers' a publisher's website. So today's event is co-sponsored by the VCU Department of History, and I'd like to thank John Powers, the chair of the History Department, for co-sponsoring both this event and other events this semester. And a word on the format today. I'll introduce our speaker, Professor Carl Suddler, and the moderator, Professor Michael Dickinson, whose conversation will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And even during the presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A function to post your questions. So I'll start by introducing Michael, whom many of us know and love. Our moderator today is Michael Dickinson, Assistant Professor of History at VCU. Professor Dickinson's research examines enslaved communities in early Anglo-American cities. And here at VCU, he teaches courses in African-American history, colonial and early Republic America, comparative slavery, and Black Atlantic history. He's the former interim director of the Mellon Scholars Program at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And more recently, Michael was the 2019-2020 Barra Sabbatical Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His book, Almost Dead, Slavery and Social Rebirth in the Black Urban Atlantic, 1680 to 1807, is forthcoming from University of Georgia Press. So many thanks, Michael, for emceeing this conversation. And I will move on next to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Carl Suddler, who is an assistant professor of history at Emory. His primary historical research interests examine the intersections of youth, race, and crime in the United States. And Professor Suddler earned his BA in history and Black American Studies from the University of Delaware and his PhD in history from Indiana University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory before he joined the history faculty, I believe in 2019. Professor Suddler's work has appeared in scholarly and popular venues such as the Journal of American History, the Journal of African American History, American Studies, the American Studies Journal, the Journal of Sports History, and many op-eds in venues such as the Washington Post, The Conversation, HuffPost, Bleacher Report, and the Brookings Institute. He has also made multiple appearances on CNN, ABC News, Al Jazeera, and NPR. His first book, on which his talk today is based, is titled Presumed Criminal: Black Youth and the Justice System in Postwar New York. And the book was published by NYU Press in 2019. And if you'd like to take a look at the publisher's website, Katie Reagan is posting a link in the chat. Of this timely and remarkable book, Professor Heather Ann Thompson in the history department at the University of Michigan said, and I quote, "In this powerful, timely, and deeply unsettling recovery of America's criminal justice past, Suddler shines vital new light on the present by brilliantly revealing the nation's post-war effort to deal with troubled young people more humanely. The book forces us to face the extent to which the presumption of Black criminality utterly undermined that effort and thereafter ensured that Black boys and girls would forever be ensnared in a fundamentally unjust juvenile justice system." End quote. I'm very grateful to Carl for taking the time to speak with us today, and I'd like to turn it over to you, Michael, and to you, Carl.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Suddler. And I know you wanted to give a little background to the project or some images to get us started. So I'll hand it over to you before we go into our questions.
Yeah, so for those well, thank you, VCU, for hosting me today. But for those who have the book, you notice that there are tons of images in the book. For those who don't have the book, I'm going to share just kind of a quick trailer, if you will, of some of the images that are in the book, accompanied by, some music to set the mood for today's conversation.
Okay, I just received some information that maybe the sound wasn't working for the for the clip, but I think the images are powerful enough to speak to a larger story of your study. And so highlighting some of those images and thinking of through the book project. First off, thank you for the book. And I think my first question in thinking about our conversation is, can you take us back to how this book and this project came to fruition? How did it start? How are you sort of led to this project?
Yeah, so like most historians, right, this project started out as a dissertation project, which for me was actually inspired even long before I got to graduate school. I remember having a conversation, and I share this actually in the acknowledgements of the book, which I think is kind of a rare story to include, but I remember having a conversation with a high school history teacher about Reuben Hurricane Carter, the boxer who was wrongfully incarcerated in the prime of his career. And I was a high school freshman when the Denzel Washington version of the movie came out. But I remember after watching the movie, going to the library, getting the book and like sitting with the book and, having a conversation with my high school history teacher, just being like, how did we let this innocent man sit in prison for all these years, right? And he was like, and he asked me, and he said, well, Carl, how do you know he's innocent? And I was like, well, it's in a book, and it's not a fiction book, right? It's a nonfiction book. 14-year-old Carl, those were only two types of books that existed, right? Fiction and nonfiction. And but then he challenged my thinking in that moment by saying, well, if he's sitting in prison writing this book, why would he write a book that, admitted his guilt, right? Of course, he's going to write a book that is going to tell a narrative of innocence, right? To help defend his case. And in that moment, I thought that guilt and innocence had as much to do with who controlled the narrative as anything else, right? And so going into graduate school, I was kind of, enamored by this idea that we could have a system that allowed innocent people to serve time, to lose time from their lives, because they were determined to be guilty by a system that was unjust, that was flawed. And so I started to dig in, and this changed a bit while in the throes of dissertation writing, because life around us, right? And so I was in the throes of writing when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I actually talk about this in the book a little bit as well. And in that moment, I just remember finding myself struggling to follow historian rule 101, right? That is, it's a historian's job to track change over time. And but I was living in the 1930s, 1940s archive, coming home and hopping on social media, looking at TV, and being in like 2012, 2013, and thinking like, there hasn't been much change over time. And so I think what's exciting is like all of these projects that many of us were working on at different times now have all come out and have all kind of pointed to that Trayvon Martin moment of really birthing a different type of conversation and, what continues to be a burgeoning literature around the carceral state at large.
That's really fascinating, and I know, as you mentioned in your afterword, you really go into Trayvon Martin, and one of the things looking back in the book, I was wondering, and I was curious about is, a lot has happened since then, right? So I'm curious if you were to rewrite the afterword today, right? What would you include? Are there certain thoughts that you would have liked to attached on looking back on it, given all things that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to rewrite the abolition, that's where my mind is, right? If I had to rewrite the afterword, especially, post summer 2020, I would have centered abolition a bit more, right? I think it's clear in the book, at least I hope it's clear in the book, that I want to reiterate, as timely as this book may have read, that there's hardly a period in US history where it would not have been timely. Right. That is, if this book comes out in the 30s, it's timely. If this book comes out in the 70s, it's timely. Because police as currently constructed, just doesn't work. Right. Well, it works. It just doesn't work the way people think it works. Right. And so, what I tried to lay out in the book is that, when we see these types of uprisings, when we see these type of protests, what lies at the center of them all is sort of an anti-Black racism, right? That's tied to our country's DNA, and we've yet to address this adequately, right? And so police is set up to reinforce that. Policing, as a verb, as an action, is grounded in this. And, I think as we continue to regularly address many of these root causes, right? Be it unemployment, failing schools, inadequate healthcare, that it's important for us to really think about starting this from scratch, right? And I think abolition is a space for us to really invite people into about creating this world in which we don't have to, or at least the solution to the problems aren't prison spaces and policing structures, right? And so if I had to rewrite the afterword, I think I would have taken a tone that was a bit more abolitionist in thought, than where it was when I wrote it at that moment.
That's really thoughtful, because I'm thinking, so in the book that you really focus on New York by and large, right? And so I'm wondering if we think about these systemic issues in urban centers, right? VCU is clearly in a major urban center, but I'm thinking about urban centers writ large across the country. How do we see these as systemic issues beyond New York? Can we see these as systemic issues beyond New York?
Yeah. And I mean, now being at Emory, I too am in an urban center in Atlanta, right? Which this summer actually, you know, meant something drastically different than when I got here, even in 2019. And so, I think when we, at its crux, presumed criminal is an African American urban history, right? That there are national kind of bookend parts of it. That if we're thinking about why I started in the 1930s with the with the Federal National Juvenile Delinquency Act, and why I end in 64, what you can make the case is around the National Civil Rights Act, right? Or the Civil Rights Act in 1964, right? That there is a larger kind of more American history narrative built into this that's tied to an African American urban story, right? That does hit on conversations and contest over unemployment and inadequate healthcare and poor schools and police brutality that is applicable in different spaces. But as a scholar of the urban North, I also think it's important for us when looking at topics of, say, policing, that we make the clear distinction about the origins, right? The origins of policing in the South, even in urban spaces, was a different origin story than policing in the North. In theory, they were the same, right? That policing were set up to protect the property of white elites, right? It's just that property for people in the South, is tied to a longer history of slave patrols, et cetera, versus when we think about policing in the North, what that property of white elites look like, take different shape, right? It's a protection of property in the more physical kind of sense and spatial kind of way. So I think there are ways that presumed criminal is telling a broader national story, right? Or a national story that is applicable to different, cities, and especially on how Black folks are navigating these cities. But at the same time, it is a very unique, New York story as well, right? And that's largely driven out of the archive and the more personal narratives that I try to include there.
So in thinking about not only the scope in terms of geographic range, in terms of also the demographic that you're focusing on, and clearly you're focusing on youth here. And I'm gonna read a quote from the text I actually brought up when I was going through it, looking over it for our discussion today, because I think it's a very powerful quote. And you say, and I think it's page 6, Black youth criminality, for all its singularities, continues to resonate as a national concern. However, few people are willing to accept the reality of their plight. And again, I think that's a powerful quote. And I just wanted to see if you could dig more into that statement, because I think there's a lot there, a lot of meat there to unravel.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, youth as a category adds an additional layer for how we can better understand the legal system, right? Especially the juvenile legal system, because age becomes fluid, right? That is, a 19-year-old white kid could be categorized as a juvenile, processed as a juvenile, and a 14-year-old Black kid can be categorized and processed as an adult, right? And this happens for a variety of reasons. But it also exposes that youth as a category needs to be discussed in similar terms to other social constructions, right? That literally can change over time. So one of the things I try to do in the book is, even how we categorize arrest in this country actually changes, right? There's a long time where we categorize anybody under the age of 21, right? And that just changes in the 1950s, right? And it's like, anybody under the age of 18, right? And like, for no real kind of rhyme or reason, aside from the fact that young people were just becoming such a force, right? In the sense of what police were out to control and out to police, that the category of being under 21 just became too big, right? And, and it wasn't telling us much of anything. So the police, and the feds in general, if we look at like the uniform crime reports, make an active decision to start categorizing youth as a category that changes in this period from under 21 to under 18. And that opens up this space for different states to institute different policies on who is then considered a youth, right? One of the things that happens right after the book comes out is New York just changed its category of who can be incarcerated as in an adult prison space, right? Like when I was writing this book, 15 and 16-year-olds in New York City could go to adult jail. That just changed, right? Like the year that the book went to print, right? And so I think there's a lot to be learned by focusing in on, or by narrowing in on kind of youth as a category here, as, you know, sort of this like, this fluctuating category that can change over time in ways that we take for granted because there's a number attached, right? Like, you know, it's one thing to talk about like race as a social construct, and who was, you know, Black in 1930s may not be considered Black today, right? And how that can evolve. But who was 14 is also 14, right? But our understanding of who was 14 actually does change. And I think it's an important part of that story.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, given, I mean, I think you make a really useful point about the malleability and social construct of age, but I'm wondering, how are you seeing this in terms of popular media? Because I think that's a larger question that we really that comes up serially, right? Especially when we see violence against African Americans, right? Age.
Yeah, no, and I think I think when I started the research for this book, right, you know, I started like most historians start with like broad newspaper searches, and you know, and I dove into a period that was, in a way, had this like heightened sense around juvenile delinquency paranoia, right? This is the day and age of like Rebel Without a Cause, of, you know, West Side Story, of kind of like, these white kids are going crazy, right? Like these white kids are like acting out in a way that we have to figure out, right? At least popular culture and mainstream kind of culture is thinking about white juvenile delinquency in a particular way. But then when you like, and when you go into popular media, whether it's like culture and film, or if you look at newspapers, you realize kind of this category of teenager that's birthed right out of this moment, is being applied and used as sort of a protective buffer for white youth in a way that it just doesn't exist for Black youth, right? So like, you know, I do a newspaper search literally of like, you know, Black youth, crime, New York City, go, what do I return, right? And you see like some really young kids, right? Some 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds getting arrested for some sort of superfluous kind of incident. And then you'll see up to sort of like, you know, 18, 19-year-old white kids, right? Categorized all as youth by newspapers. But then when I went back and like changed the terms of the search, right, to look up young men or young women, what you quickly realize is that like 16-year-old Black youths who were being incarcerated or being arrested for whatever acts were categorized as young men, young women, right, or men and women, right? And so even the labels themselves by the media take on a different kind of meaning on how it's being portrayed out to the public, right? That is like a 16-year-old, whether they're Black or white, is a teenager, right? But the media's kind of coverage of the case dramatically alters the public perception of who these people are, right? That they are more adult than what we typically think of for people in this age range. And that's something that continues to permeate, right? I mean, if we're thinking about, you know, Michael Brown and 14, right? Like when people were categorized, you know, thinking of, you know, how big and burly and frightening he was. You know, same could be said for Trayvon Martin. Same could be said for somebody like Tamir Rice, right? You know, who's, you know, literally a child playing with a toy gun, who just doesn't reserve or who doesn't have that kind of buffer or protection of youth, right? As kind of a category in ways that we know and we've seen time and time again white youth be able to have.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because I'm thinking about, so I clearly do a lot with slavery, right? That's my area of expertise, but could we make the argument, right, that the connections to these larger tropes, right, of not only criminality, but also in terms of, you know, the level of threat of, you know, African Americans, particularly African American men, and that's something that really trickles down from slavery, right? And then we see a larger legacy of this perceived threat of African Americans in terms of their physical threat, right? The threat of their physical bodies. We see that as sort of a through line through history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important that even though my book starts in the 1930s, right, conversations around the juvenile legal system specifically do start in the late 19th century, right? They are coming about in the 1800s, with the establishment of separate court systems for young people. And generally, when we think about the progressive era reformers who are kind of like leading the charge here, their intent seem okay, right? Like their intent genuinely seemed to be invested in protecting young people from the stigma of adult criminality, from the punishments that adults are facing, right? For acts that can be kind of determined by immaturity for whatever reason, right? And they what they realized was that we needed a system in place that allowed kids to be kids, right? That if a kid was going to make a mistake, that they should not be judged by the worst mistake of their life if they make it at 15, right? They have a whole life ahead of them. They ought not to, and I'd make the case that we need to move that logic even forward, right? That not even somebody who commits a crime at the age of 30 ought to be judged the rest of their life for it, right? But in particular, at the foundation of this, juvenile legal system is that you want to protect young people from sort of, how we're doling out punishment to adults. And, and that changes dramatically in the 1930s, right? And I'd make the case that you really start seeing the early inklings of being tough on crime in this period when we kind of no longer allow like crime prevention and crime, rehabilitation to kind of lead the charge. And we do kind of see, if you commit a crime, you will be punished, kind of take off. And, and it births, what's gonna come with the war on crime and with the war on drugs and with the growth of mass incarceration. We see so many of those early inklings in this period. That again, to get back to the original question, are tied to kind of these much longer kind of questions of like Black folks and threat, right? And kind of, or at least perceived threat. There's something about the perceived notion of deviance, right, that Black people in particular places present. And, authoritatively, we see systems come in to try to control that. And, that translates whether we're talking about 19th century, early 20th century, or 21st century. Right?
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially when we think about policy. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind came to mind for me when you were just answering the question was, I think it was Bill Clinton a few years back, right? He gets into a lot of hot water for using the term super predator, way back when, but he sort of doubles down on it rather than try to apologize for it. And so I think I'm wondering how you see this trickling down not only through the court system, not only through media, but also through policy, right? When we think about a powerful politician like a former president using this sort of language.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, politicians are huge in this, right? Because, we know for anybody who's familiar with kind of studying periods of mass incarceration is that like language of tough on, the tougher you can show yourself to be on crime, the more likely you are to win office, right? And that matters, and that's been the case whether we're talking about mayors and governors or we're talking about, presidents. You can't be as soft on crime at any point. In the period that I'm looking at, somebody who comes out a ton is somebody like Mayor LaGuardia, right? Like Mayor LaGuardia has like this, ridiculous relationship with Black New York. As somebody who on the one hand is going to appoint the first Black woman judge in US history in the 1930s. And people are like, oh, this is like an early sign that LaGuardia is committed to civil rights. And then go off in 1943 and use the police to, quell an uprising in a way that's, arguably one of the earlier times that we see a militarization of a police force, right? And so, so politicians have always kind of been part and parcel of that narrative in how they make decisions on when to employ police and what type of force to employ police, how to use the police, and really how to get other people kind of involved, right? Like I think, there were moments this summer, especially here in Atlanta, that I think about somebody like Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, right? As a Black woman mayor of a major city, and thinking about like her stance on like what the police role ought to be in quelling uprising and protests over the summer. To me, it was like eerily similar to what we see with LaGuardia. Like LaGuardia is going to affluent Black New Yorkers in Harlem in the 40s, you know, being like, come get your people, right? Like, and you know, so when I saw like Keisha Lance Bottoms come up to stage with like T.I. and Killer Mike, I'm just like, this is LaGuardia in 43, right? This is the come get your people moment. That on the surface looks like you're trying to build a connection with the community by, you know, pulling from the community to speak to your community, right? But in practice, it's, you know, just reinforcing so much of what we know as sort of like, this has all to do with your own political gain because you can't show yourself to be soft on crime or you run the risk of losing your next election.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'm thinking about not only the political element here, but also, I mean, what does it mean to be a parent of an African-American child, right? Given sort of these, I mean, this idea of being presumed criminal, right? How do we think about, you know, Black parenthood and the Black family, given this historical dynamic?
Yeah. Or, I mean, what does the state say about parents that they feel so comfortable removing Black kids from their homes, right? You know, because the juvenile legal system in a weird way often plays the role of a surrogate parent, right? And so for the system to come in and remove a kid from their home is actually as much of a kind of defamation to the family household, right, that it is to the actual behavior, right? That the kid is partly in this situation because of the home situation, right? And so institutionalization becomes part of that fix, which is a removal from the family home. And so, you know, in terms of how does it feel to be a Black parent, you know, I think it's important for us to, again, if we look at these moments, whether we're talking about Trayvon Martin, or whether we're talking about like Jordan Davis, or whether we're talking, you know, and we think about the mothers of these boys, right, who have since, you know, become public facing figures. Some have taken political office, etc. I write about a case in the book in 1964 Harlem, where those mothers led the, you know, organizing efforts, right, to get their boys clemency, right, writing letters to the governor, organizing on the ground. Because they realize that it's an indictment on them when the system comes in this way, right? That they aren't in their own position to protect their kids from this system, right? That the system kind of maintains this sort of control that can even, you know, strip them or deny them of being a parent, right? Which is ultimately the most protective buffer, right, of a parent over a child. And so for the system to reserve that right to deny a mother, right, of being a mother, to deny a father of being a father, you know, speaks to a much broader kind of problem.
Wow. So I'm thinking, especially, I mean, I know in my own research, right, and I think historians in general, there are certain examples, certain pieces of evidence, certain cases that sometimes just resonate with us and sort of stay with us. And I'm wondering if there was a particular one in writing the book and conducting your research that really you connected with or stayed with you more than some of the others.
Yes. I think sometimes what can often get overlooked when researching and writing about the carceral state more broadly, right? And so, you know, just for general audience purposes, when I say something like carceral state, right, it means like of or belonging to prisons, right? And so we're talking about police, we're talking about incarceration, but we're also talking about stuff like the welfare system, right? Again, that kind of has these broader systemic ties to the larger prison state. And I think what can often get overlooked when we write and research and live in these kind of spaces academically, especially as it relates to young people, it's kind of like stories of just lost potential, right? I think it hits home differently. Like there is such a minute difference between a kid who can end up in the system and a kid who ends up in college, right? and the lost potential that you see time and time again, whether it's through countless cases of wrongful convictions or just the unnecessary trauma of living in occupied space of the police, right? Who have to navigate a world of stop and frisk on the daily, who, you know, like you find yourself just thinking about like all of the lost potential because of that, right? You know, I think about somebody like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who regularly writes and reminds us that like prison is not a building over there, right? Prisons are sets of relationships that undermine rather than stabilize everyday lives everywhere, right? And I think when we understand these systems in those kinds of ways, you just realize just how inhumane they are. And how inhumane they naturally need to be to kind of keep their power. And you know, and it ought to kind of give pause and reflection about like, what do we think these things are doing? Because typically the case is that, you know, they're providing safety, when in actuality, that's one of their last responsibilities, or definitely one of the last things that they take, you know, into account.
Yeah, I think that's a useful way of thinking through, you know, in more depth what's going on with these communities. So I wonder if you can sort of elaborate more about this idea of social trauma, right, of these overly policed communities. How do we think about social trauma in these very real ways in communities that were they're over policed, right? There's a fear not only of policing but of incarceration, as you mentioned, right? How do we really think of the idea of social trauma here?
I mean, in a weird way, like when you know, just thinking about that question off the top of my head, like the first place I went to was the insurrection, right? In January 6th of this year. And I just thought to myself, like watching it all kind of unfold, white people are not scared of the police the way Black people are in this country, right? They just do not have that kind of relationship where they have to move in fear of that authority. And that was on full display for the world to see on January 6th, right? That they were, the last thing that was on their mind was going to prison or worse, right? Being murdered by these police and the police getting away with it. Right. And that is just not a world that for a majority of Black folks, we've been able to kind of have that relationship with the police. And to me, I often think that when we think of kind of the anti-Black racism that really persists policing as, you know, a project in this country, so much of it has to do with sort of living in this state of fear, right? And that's why, you know, when we have conversations around defunding, or when we have conversations around abolition, I think it's so important for us to understand that Black communities, in particular, what I'm talking about in relation to the book, right? Like most like African-American urban communities here in this place, right? Because we can talk about Black rural spaces or Black, you know, country spaces and suburban spaces in different kinds of ways. But the occupation of city spaces by the police just reminds us that proximity to, or their simple presence there, actually doesn't prevent crime in any kinds of ways, right? That the place in which the police are physically the most are still the places that we have quote unquote more crime, actually is a case against their presence being there in the first place, right? Like if in fact we think that it's a police job to prevent or to protect these communities, right? And so what is it, right? Like how then do we get to the point where these communities can regularly be referred to as being both over-policed and underprotected at the same time, right? And, you know, so much of that has to do with, you know, what, again, like, you know, it's an origin story, and it's so important for us to understand policing and where it kind of comes from and how we got to the point where their presence has kind of regularly resulted in kind of trauma that Black folks have had to live in this country, right? You know, nothing worse than you driving down a highway, and doing absolutely nothing wrong, looking in your rearview mirror, seeing a police, and think, oh God, I hope nothing happens. Right? You're doing nothing wrong, right? And again, the reason I kind of started this point with the insurrection is not only that I think it's important for us to realize how the police respond to something like a Black Lives Matter protest in relation to how they responded on January 6th. But I think it's also important to realize just how the people were moving in a space that had that police presence, right? They just didn't care, right? They were able to move in a fearless kind of manner that you just don't see regularly in other communities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm thinking, I mean, you mentioned not doing anything wrong, but I'm wondering, right, the flip side of that, I think arguably there's a different expectation when we do things wrong, right? I'm thinking about, when I was pulled over for my first speeding ticket, I knew I was speeding, but it's a different sort of interaction there, right? And so how do we also think about policing, in terms of a sense, even when we do, break a law, right? The expectation should be, is sort of different based off of racialized population.
Yeah, and again, and it shouldn't be that way, right? Like, like, obviously we can point to like the extreme measures of somebody like a Dylan Roof, right? Who can, roll up in with all, the wrongful intentions, right? Or more recently, we can point to like Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Who shows up, like, who crosses state borders with a gun in tow, with mom driving, right? And just thinking about kind of like, hey guys, I'm here with you, right? And the response being like, thank you for your help. Right? Like it is literally mind-blowing to see it, right? And there's really like no kind of logical explanation beyond, right? Like this is just racism 101, right? This is how race works in this country. And when we think about policing as part of this larger kind of race project, we have to take these kinds of moments into account, right? We have to sit with these moments and think like, how does one get to the point where one fears for their life in the event that they're doing nothing wrong, definitely fears for their life if they get caught for doing something wrong, compared to somebody who's just like, you can't touch me, right? Like how did we get here? It's such kind of a revealing story of where we are in 2021 with the kind of current construction of the police state.
So I do have a follow-up, but as we sort of reach towards the end of our conversation, just want to encourage anyone who has questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. Christina just posted a message, so feel free, and we'll read those aloud once they're posted. But just to follow up with your larger point, I'm wondering, where do we go from here in terms of policing, right? Given everything we know historically and contemporarily, do you have any thoughts about, how we should work at reform, abolition? What should that look like in your mind?
Yeah, no, I think we have to keep pushing conversations of abolition, right? And the reason I think abolition becomes the push is that allows and creates the space for conversations like defunding and divestment to then become mainstream, right? That becomes the compromise. And if we get to the point that that is the compromise for now, like within our lifetime, then we may be able to shift the needle just slightly, right? And I don't think it's no small feat that conversations of divestment, of defunding, of abolition have become mainstream, right? And that is thanks to generations of activists and organizers who have been pushing it for decades, right? But the more we see these kind of growing numbers of city school boards voting to terminate their contracts with local police departments, like this is a step in the right direction. And I think contrary to those who believe that abolition leads to chaos, I think it's a time for them to to dive back into your era, right? And think about, you know, what the conversations around the abolition of slavery look like, right? What the skepticism around the abolition of slavery look like. Why were there people who were advocating for a gradual abolition compared to kind of an all-out abolition, right? Because the fear was that on the other side, there was total chaos, right? That if in fact we just get rid of this system cold cut, like the world is going to go crazy. But it, I mean, history allows us to know that it actually doesn't, right? It was actually the step that we needed, right? There was the step at that moment that we needed to keep the conversation going forward. And so I think as long as we keep pushing conversations and narrative of abolition, that forces the compromise to become defunding and divestments. You know, I think we're, you know, I think there's a way that we can look at that as sort of trending in the right direction. And the reason but even then, I think it's important for us to heed caution, right? Because I started the conversation saying that, you know, what leads people down kind of, or at least popular narrative, what leads people down towards life of crimes is sort of what's central to this country's DNA and kind of anti-Black racism, especially around institutions of education, employment, housing, healthcare, right? So when we have conversations around defunding, if it's a matter of reallocating those resources, that if in fact we're going to reallocate them to systems of, say, education, that still have anti-Black racism at its core, that doesn't necessarily lead to a fix, right? That, you know, in a way, the conversation of abolition is a matter of getting rid of, is recentering or refocusing our energies on everything, right? That just simply moving funds from the police, you know, project to education isn't necessarily going to fix the problems if our education systems continue to persist with anti-Black racism at its core, right? And so we need to have serious conversations, even around, you know, when we're talking defunding and divestment, about what the reallocation process looks like, how it's going to work out, and to whose favor it's going to work the best, because there's still a power dynamic at play there.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, I'm just thinking about images during the pandemic of our frontline workers not having the materials they need, police having all these resources. I think in part you answered, you started to answer, or you, in many ways, you answered one question we had from one of our audience members. How do we continue to push the conversation of abolition in a palatable way, one that does not create fear among mostly white people?
Yeah, no, and, you know, thank you for that question. I think, you know, to reinforce the point, I think it's important for us to revisit abolition in other places, right? About what it looked like in this country to abolish slavery, what the conversations look like around the hesitancy around abolishing slavery, what it, and even from, like, again, like people who were like, well, this is why gradual abolition is the move, right? Like if we look at gradual abolitionists as people kind of advocating for defunding and divestment right now, right? That there are lessons to be learned that if that's the move, there's never going to be the right moment, right? That there's never going to be the right moment to kind of cut ties from a system that we know is inherently flawed, right? So how then do we get to this point where we can imagine a world in which we no longer need the police as currently constructed, right? In which we no longer need prisons as solutions to any of these types of problems, right? And that's not to say that we're in a space where we have all of the answers. Just like if we look toward the abolition of slavery, we had all of the answers to neither, right? That part and parcel of kind of the abolition project is imaginative work, is thinking about a future in which, you know, what does the world look like without this? Because we've become so accustomed to live in a world with it.
Michael, if I can interject for 1 second, I haven't tried this before in our webinars, but I'm thinking of asking Mignon to actually ask her next question live, if that's okay. Mignon, would you like to ask your next question live? I think I can do that. Oh, no, sorry.
Hello?
Oh, there she is. Go ahead, Mignon.
because I keep posting questions and comments, because this is a fabulous discussion. Thank you both so much. It's just, wow. So which one was my next question? Because I had another one coming. So I was asking about how do we find ways to introduce these discussions in spaces like what criminal justice studies. The ivory tower is not immune to anti-Black racism. You know, the ivory tower is very ivory still. And yet these young people that are in college that are studying these topics need to understand these issues, and they need to understand how to push the needle. And, you know, I'm concerned that many, I won't say most, many are getting their information from Twitter, right? and they're sort of tagging buzzwords based on Twitter, but they don't understand these fundamental underpinnings that you're enlightening that are tremendously important in their study. So how do we infiltrate these areas, Dr.
Yeah.
Sudder?
No, I mean, so thank you for that question, Mignot. I think I'll start off by saying if I had the answer, I probably wouldn't still be sitting with many of these questions, right? And kind of thinking it out, you know, in various platforms, whether it's books and op-eds and, you know, what have you. I think one way that we could encourage kind of the shift, especially in academic spaces, is to think of kind of curriculum development more broadly, right? I mean, criminal justice programs in particular have long been spaces that have trained people to become police officers, or not only police officers, but broadly speaking, you know, parts of the system in different spaces, right? And you know, for even the most well-meaning, right, we then have conversations with folks who are like, well, I'm getting within the system to try to change it, right? And then you revisit that conversation 20 years into their career and you ask them, so how did that go for you? And they have to sit with this realistic space that changing these things from within become really, really tough, right? You know, this is where I like have conversations about like diversifying the police, right? Because this is a conversation that we have both in academic spaces, but we also have in community spaces, right? Typically the response from the community is that we can't get rid of the police, but we need more police who look like us, who come from our communities to do this type of work. The problem is we have 100 years of data that shows us that diversifying the police force actually doesn't change it.
Exactly. Sorry.
And so,
yes.
yeah. And so, you know, there is a disconnect, right, between what people think are solutions and what people think haven't been tried in the past, right? And so I think, you know, if we have broader conversations around curricular development, it's a way to kind of introduce students in college spaces to these types of conversations. I think the tougher one is actually having this conversation with the community. You know, that is, I find more students willing to engage with conversations around abolition than I can find in communities, right? And that disconnect is actually interesting to me because, you know, there's something to be said about being at an institution like Emory and having students who are like, yes, abolish the police force, who never have day-to-day interaction with the police. And then you go into a community and you're just like, how about we start the conversation at abolition? And it's just like, no, we need the police for these reasons, right? And that disconnect is I think the conundrum that we've been fighting for a long time and that we, you know, have yet to really figure out the best way to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to let some of the graduate students who've read your book ask some of their questions, if that's okay, Carl?
Yeah, that's fine.
So our graduate seminar in critical race theory has read your book, and unfortunately, because of cancellations yesterday, yesterday we couldn't talk about it. So let me go to Jessica Casey, who will ask her question next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the Central Park Five were awarded a $41 million settlement. Do you think that's fair compensation for the horrors they faced when they were incorrectly incarcerated? How do we atone for events like that and place a monetary value on their experiences?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Jessica. The yes or no part of the question, no, that wasn't fair compensation for the horrors they faced. I don't think we can actually place a monetary value on it. I think a lot about Breonna Taylor family more recently getting, a suit paid for, a wrongful suit from the Louisville PD, right? And and actually, I think what those payouts show is just how expensive poor policing is, right? And it kind of reinforced how expensive poor policing is. The problem with it is that the police aren't held, not even financially responsible for those payouts, right? That those payouts actually come from community taxpaying dollars, right? And so like there's a way that it's like, if we're talking about the exonerated five, if we're talking about Breonna Taylor's case, that people from within the community are ultimately footing the bill. That's an issue, right? I think a lot about Rayshawn Ray's work, who's a sociologist at University of Maryland, who talks a lot about like one means of reform that we've yet to kind of consider is thinking about ways to hold police departments more financially responsible for police misconduct, right? That is, if we start to hit the police force in the pockets, will we see their behaviors change? That is, do we start thinking about ways of taxing pensions from police officers who are part of police forces that allow for wrongful, police incidents, whether we're talking again exonerated five or something like the Breonna Taylor payout. And I think that's an avenue worth exploring, mostly because it's one that we haven't tried yet, right? But I think if we sit back and think about lost potential, there's just never going to be a right dollar amount to how we can calculate for what was lost, whether we're talking about the case of Central Park, or the exonerated five, who knock on wood, are luckily still with us, or somebody like Breonna Taylor, whose families will have to forever deal with that loss. Because she is no longer with us, right? And so I don't, you fall down a slippery slope when thinking about like what type of dollar value to put there. And instead, I just think, I think the move is accountability, right? That somebody has to be held accountable for these acts, and kind of the common thread is that largely these people haven't been.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Carl. So, sort of a similar question by another graduate student. Nick Brown, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to ask it? I can try to unmute you. I'm sorry, I'm just doing this for the first time, so thank you for, there he is.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure, and part of this seems to be answered, but it's kind of two-pronged. Do you see your work as a form of protest, like a sort of social justice work? If so, is this work for a particular audience? What does it offer a Black audience?
Okay. No, thanks for that question, Nick. I think, and it's funny because I actually just tweeted something yesterday, thinking about something completely unrelated to the book, but thinking of somebody like John Hope Franklin, who, prominent African-American historian, who often encouraged African-American historians to not only see themselves as writing history, but actually being part of history, right? That our presence in the field itself is a making history part, right? That the work that we're doing is part and parcel of that, but the actual presence, right? The ability to then train, future members of the professoriate, all of this, right? It is actually, tied to kind of larger conversations about what our presence in academia actually means and accounts to, right? And so in that sense, not only is the work a form of kind of social justice work, but the sheer presence is. In terms of audience, when I was writing the book, I thought a lot about audience in the sense that I needed it to be an academic book for tenure purposes, right? Whatever that means, right? I needed it to get me over the tenure hurdle. But I wanted to write it in a way, both in format and in tone and in language, that was accessible beyond the professoriate, right? I wanted to be able to put my book or have my book on a table at a barber shop and somebody somewhere pick it up and see something worth value to them in it. And I took that personal in terms of a challenge on what that looks like in an academic book. And so what you'll notice is I tried to bury lots of theory and historiographical arguments like in the footnotes, right? I'm like, all you historians out there, go read the footnotes if you want that substance. And in the process, try to center the stories, right? I wanted people to pick it up and walk away like, man, you remember that story about the 1943 uprising, or how he categorized like the kids, who were wearing the looted suits, right? And what the kind of media did and to run with that image. Or do you remember the story of the 1964 Harlem Six, right? On how these 6, young Black boys were wrongfully kind of incarcerated for 9 years, 10 years, and almost 30 years. For me, centering the stories here was pivotal so that the audience could range beyond just kind of traditional academic settings. So I think that tries to answer, I guess, some of it or all of it. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Carl, and thanks, Nick, for this great question. I think we are running out of time, so I want to be mindful. Maybe we can take one last question, and then Michael, if you have any last remarks or comments for Carl. Tamika Ferguson, if you're still here and if you'd like to ask your question, I just gave you like the technical part to participate. So if not, I can read it for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
By the way, hey, Carl, good to see you.
Hey, Tamika.
We went to IU together.
We have the Hoosier connection.
Nice.
Totally. So one of the things that's interesting I'm actually a professor at VCU in the School of Education, and I'm interested in kind of the intersection of K-12 education. And so my question is thinking about some of the ways in which you were troubling like the social definitions of youth and expectation and behaviors and ways in which people are learning how to respond to forms of authority. Sometimes that's reinforced and taught within the K-12 school system. And so I'm really interested in your thoughts around the way that we can rethink the K-12 space and or teacher education. It's like this opportunity to challenge some of these normalized understandings around what is considered a youth behavior, the misinformation about the influence of the justice system for Black youth. I think it's an area that's talked about and explored somewhat within Black girl education, but I'm really interested in from your perspective from history, what you think.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Tamika. I think a lot about what the legal system does with youth, how it can be reinforced in other spaces like the K-12 system, as sort of like putting, Black boys, but Black girls as well, kind of in like this catch-22 space, right? That what we actually want is kids to be able to be kids, right? But that doesn't necessarily come at the cost of denying their manhood and their womanhood, right? And that actually like treads on a very fine line, right? I think about even when I was like writing the book about like, what am I doing by saying I want to extend the protective buffer of youth beyond kind of the traditional category, right? That's not to say that I wanted to deny an 18-year-old college kid their manhood, right? Or their womanhood, right? But what I want them, I want them to have the space to be, right? And interestingly enough, it's not like those spaces don't exist, right? And this is where I think it's important for us to understand how white youths are able to kind of live these free lives of fear of messing up for whatever reason. And that carries on well beyond, well into adulthood, right? And so it's not like we don't have the comparative kind of space to do that. And so I think what's important for us, or something to kind of encourage K through 12 teachers in particular, is to respect kind of the humanity of the youngster, while kind of just letting them be and explore, right? While letting them kind of, live freely in a space that is a classroom, right? A protective space in some ways, because we know that in the world, they're not going to be able to live freely, right? And that's kind of a tough kind of conundrum of how we can think about ways of using the K through 12 classroom as sort of like I don't want to keep referring to it as protective, right? Because even that becomes problematic over time. But as a space in which we can create for young people to live freely, to allow us the imaginative space of what it would mean for them to then traverse into a world and live the same way. How that happens, I have no idea. I just, you know, I'd like to think that it can. I will say, I think what's interesting, especially, and this is just kind of a quick note, because most of my friends have kids at this point, and all of them love Paw Patrol. I think a lot about how police and good cop narratives are actually like forced into conversations of youth at a very, very young age, right? Conversation, you know, like I think about like my friend being like, I hate that my son loves Paw Patrol because now he thinks all the cops are, you know, are characters from the cartoon, right? And you know, and I have to tell him as a Black boy that his relationship to this system is going to be something different, right? So how then do we kind of let the kid enjoy Paw Patrol because all their friends are enjoying Paw Patrol, while kind of living in a reality in which the police that he see on the streets aren't the same, right? Or aren't going to see him the same, especially as he kind of matures in U.S. society at large. And so I don't have an answer on the how. I just have an answer on how I wish or how I can hope, I guess.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Suddler. And I'll ask you one last question just to leave us off, because I think many of us are probably wondering, what's next in terms of your research, in terms of your writing? I know it's a tough question, but what we're curious, I'm sure we're all curious, what's next?
What's next? You sound like the P&T committee. No, I'm so I'm working on a book tentatively titled No Way Out, that looks at sport reform and the limits of social mobility, right? I'm invested in kind of understanding sports' broader connection to behavioral reform and racial capitalism, really since the late 19th century, and how it's been kind of used in these kind of like, you know, ultra kind of carceral capacities as well. Because what I found was that in researching the criminalization of Black youth for this project, I was struck by how the state regularly extended its surveillance powers through recreation and organized sports, right? That at the same time that the progressive, you know, reformers are advocating for a separate juvenile system, so too is the establishment of police athletic leagues, of YMCAs, of amateur athletic associations, of the NCAA, right? All of these things actually come together around the same time. And a lot of these people were actually in a lot of the same rooms. And so I think, you know, it's important, you know, for me in this next project to really think about how sport fits into this narrative. That again, I think is more tied to behavioral reform than, you know, than has met the eye kind of more popularly. And so we'll see where it leads to. I'm in the early stages. No, I'm actually finishing an article that looks at like the work that Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella did at the Harlem YMCA in the 40s and 50s. Nice. And I'm hoping that that'll serve into the springboard of this kind of broader project that I've actually been thinking and shaping a lot about more recently.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carl. And my apologies, we went over just a little bit, and I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. I just wanted to say thank you both. Thank you, Michael, for moderating. Good luck with your next book project, Carl. And we look forward to, you know, your visit to VCU when we go back to whatever sort of normal will be. And I'd like to also thank the audience for attending today's event, because VCU canceled classes and everything. So this is really people who are interested in you and your talk. And by way of concluding, I'd like to say that our next event at the HRC is this coming Monday at noon. And it's a wonderful book publishing workshop with Adina Burke of Yale University. And she's amazing. So I think everyone should attend. It's a free event at noon. It'll last 1 hour. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you there. And looking forward, our last event in the speaker series, this larger speaker series this semester, will be Professor Kathleen Cahill of Penn State University on March 12th. Also Friday at noon, whose talk will be on recasting the vote, how women of color transformed the suffrage movement. And we hope to see many of you and your students there. Thank you all for spending this time with us today and for supporting the humanities at VCU. And I wish you all a great weekend. Thanks again, Carl and the team. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good day.